The most recent TFT patch is the biggest patch in TFT history. The entire meta got shaken up, and no longer are hero augments dominant. In fact, they're some of the worst things you can play in the game. So what's on top and what do we play? Let's go ahead and dive into the TFT Academy tier list and find out. Let's talk about the primary game plan for this patch. At stage 2-1 at the beginning of the game, look for some kind of vertical to commit to. There's more spats in the game, and the way you can get them consistently is by reforging things like spatula and pan into the other side. Before in the past, if you reforged a spatula, it would turn into a component like a bow or a sword. But now the spatula will always turn into the pan, and the pan will now always turn into the spatula. And the pan basically makes a whole new list of emblems. For example, multi-striker emblem is now bow plus a pan, and now that's the way you can get to 7 multi-striker consistently, making some of those reroll combos very good. And now there's even more portals like Let 'em Cook and Frying Pan, which gives you those to start the game. If you have no emblem, look for a 4-cost fast 8 and build a game plan based on your items and your augments. If you have melee items, you're going to go for Fiora and Gwen, and then your backup option if you don't hit is Olaf. If you play a lot of AP items, you're probably going to aim for Karma, and then your backup option is Ryze. And if you have a bunch of attack speed and AD ranged items, you look for Kalista, but your backup option is Varus. And if all else fails, look for a safe reroll comp for top 4 that's uncontested, so that way you can get out of there as soon as possible and let everyone else fight over those verticals. And if you don't believe me, just look at all the top performing augments currently in the game. I took the top 15 and only 2 of them are not vertically trait related. Even Little Buddies is something that you want to play in verticals because you're playing a lot of the cheap 1 and 2 costs of that trait to activate the 4 and 5 costs. So overall, it's very, very powerful. So let's go ahead and start off the tier list, beginning at S tier. Starting over at the top, we had the newly restructured Faerie Trait. Faerie for this patch has now been restructured to be a 3-5-7 breakpoint. And that is different because now you get the Queen's Crown at 3, which is a big deal for all these flex boards. But the trade-off is at 5, now you get the Queen's Guard armor, which is an insane item. And then they buff Rakan by giving him double the amount of shield value while reducing his mana. So basically, now if you get Queen's Guard armor on Rakan and 5 Faerie, he becomes really, really difficult to deal with, even at 1 star. BIS for this comp is going for Rage Blades on Kalista and going for defensive like Warmog's, Stoneplate, or Redemption on Rakan, and then trying to stall out fights. It's actually very similar to the way Kalista played with Bastions, where you just have like an unkillable front line, and then you just like ramp with Rage Blades and then kill everything over time. As such, because you're not really trying to play around Last Whisper nearly as much, you can go for like Even Shroud on Hecarim, which is ideal. But in the worst case scenario, just make a Last Whisper anyways and put on somebody else. And then Katarina ends up being a duo, but if you do end up getting contested in some capacity, just forget Katarina, put items on Hecarim instead, or perhaps a different unit entirely. If you get Morgana too, for example, don't worry about your duo carry, that's Morgana. If you hit Camille, you can play Camille as well instead of like a Kali and don't care about Warrior. And that also gives you the flexibility of a Preserver slot. There's a lot of debate right now about whether or not 5 or 7 Faerie is correct on level 8. The downside of 7 Faerie is that you're playing often units like Seraphine and Tristana, which are pretty weak. But the upside is it's a very cheap board that gets you a ton of stats. And the most important thing is you need to get to 9. You need to get to 9 because the 5 costs are really powerful. Specifically, Milio is the key to the comp because that is what really gives a lot of power through the item scaling. And you want that Morgana/Camille as soon as you can. But 5 Faerie allows you to play things like Preservers, Multi-Strikers, and Flex your options. And so don't feel like you have to always play that 7 Faerie. 9 Faerie is the strongest vertical in the game. So if you get 2 emblems of some kind, definitely chase for it at 9. And that also counts for a dummy if you get like a Golem with it early with Trainer Golems. I've seen 9 Faerie beat 9 Frost. I've seen it beat 10 Portal. I've seen it beat all the Witchcraft boards and the Chrono boards. So I think 9 Faerie is the strongest vertical in the game, pretty much outside of just like 10 Eldritch. One thing to note too is that Faerie Crown is a lot weaker than Faerie Crest because Faerie Crown gives you a Tristana and a Giant Slayer. And that's like a 2 cost with an item that doesn't do well in the early game because Giant Slayer activates more towards late game when everyone has a lot of HP. And Faerie Crest gives you like the same thing plus the Tristana, which should also theoretically be like the 3 activation for the Faerie Queen's Crown. So they basically kind of are like the same thing. And so you might actually end up being in a situation where you think, oh, I have a Faerie Crown early. That's going to be really good. But in the stats, Faerie Crown actually does kind of poorly early. So that's just something to consider. And that's going to be true for a lot of verticals that we talk about. Royal Guard is probably the best AVP in the game if you can get the Faerie +1. And things like Little Buddies are always going to be extremely powerful because you're playing so many low-cost units. Frost is Titan number 2 of the big 3 verticals right now. Frost is quite versatile and very similar to Fairy, can be played without the Frost emblem for safe top 4s, but you end up having a very, very high cap. If you don't have Frost, you basically cut this Frost emblem on Varus and try to aim for, say, like a Briar on Swain, and you just play it for like 5 Frost. Or maybe you cut Zilly instead, but you know that gives you access to Morgana. You just have a little bit more flexible spots. This is often what you play when you get like a Frost Crown to start things off, or you get the new Frosty Frontline augment that gives you a little bit of a wolf. The main thing about it since the last time we've talked about this comp is that the items have updated. You actually really want utility on Varus. It is important to note things like Ruden's Hurricane can activate the Pyro Execute, so that's what makes it really strong on Varus. Also, fun fact, that also works on things like Static Shiv, but you're not really trying to build that as a priority, plus you need so many bows. A lot of times you end up just going for like a 3rd damage item. So like Giant Slayer, Infinity Edge, things like that. And a lot of times people build that because they're just using Varus as the utility while they're making Olaf as the primary. The real key though with this composition is tempo. You want to play from ahead because it really matters how fast you're hitting things like Diana and Olaf, and you need to get to 8 as soon as possible. One thing about Frost that some people ask all the time is, am I playing around Hui? Like, am I going to roll for a 3-star Hui? Not really. Hui can just hold items. Nasus takes a bunch of belts and the vests and the cloaks. And yeah, pretty much just get to 8, roll for Olaf, Varus, Nasus. Get to 9, look for Diana and Briar and other things like that. And then try to get to 9 Frost if you can. The last of the big 3 is good old faithful Portal. It's still really strong. 10 Portal is still the best trait in the game. And somehow it just keeps happening very often. They added 2 more portals, meaning the beginning choice at the start of the game where you choose between the 3 different like galaxies that you go to. They added Frying Pan and Let Them Cook. An important thing to note, you can reforge a Frying Pan into a spatula. In the past, when you reforged a spatula, it would turn into a component. So you could reforge a spatula that you didn't want into, say, like a rod or a bow. But now when you reforge a spatula, it turns into a pan. You reforge a pan, it turns into a spatula. So now you have even more opportunities to get to a 10 portal. And 8 portal is still perfectly fine if you're just stuck on 1. AP items on Ryze, as per usual. Leftover items on Nami or Nora. Generally, Nora 2 caps the highest, but in the ideal scenario, you have items on all 3. Terracole's defensive items, maybe extra bonus items on Diana. I mean, it doesn't really matter. If you hit 10 portal, you just win the game. They also buffed Trait Tracker. I have seen people try to go for Portal with Trait Tracker, and it's really nice because Zoe and Galio have triple traits, so it makes it easy for these 2 units to proc a bunch of Trait Tracker activations and get extra emblems. And so sometimes you play like 8 Portal with a ton of crazy stuff. We still got a lot more verticals to talk about, but there is one hero augment that stands very true and is one of the best comps in the game, and that's Zap Attack Blitzcrank. And that's largely due to the fact that Honeymancy as a trait has gotten reworked to be very good at 3 Honeymancy. And in general, 7 Honeymancy is also extremely strong. And so it's kind of like a vertical in some ways. If you can go for 7 Honeymancy, it's very, very good. There's 2 versions of Blitzcrank that I want to go over, and we're probably going to dip into the A tier as well to show it. The first version that we're showing is Mages, where you go for Blitzcrank 3 and Veigar 3. And now I believe this is the strongest way to play Veigar Mages. If you try to play the Vex version, it's just too slow to get online. It still can do well, but I personally think that Blitzcrank Hero just gives you so much HP, time, and tempo. And so you go for the usual blue buff Nashers and either Shojin or Death Cap for Veigar and try to cap around 5 mages. Fun little fact, if you end up playing this variation, you don't want Vex at all because you already have your front line squared away. So you just go for Soraka 3 instead, and that's like a 1 cost you can play around. Soraka can even hold items for Veigar, for example, if you're not playing around Ziggs. The second variation that we can talk about is Ziggs. And this actually kind of dips a little bit of an early preview into the A tier, but if you want to play Ziggs as a primary carry, right now we found an innovation where you would go for Cassiopeia plus Poppy 3 because they buffed Cassio, so she's much more reliable as a secondary duo. And 5 Honeymancy is not really worth it because you have to play things like a Veigar, which doesn't do much without mage or items, and a Kog'Maw, which is actually quite good for utility, but then you're kind of stuck with like an awkward 4 out of 5. So Poppy and Cassio ends up being really good. Then you roll for like maybe 3-star Nuno and Ahri on the side, and then you get a bunch of extra AP, and then Ziggs becomes your primary carry. I have a Ziggs comp guide to help show you guys how to position, so if you want to look at that video, you can get more information. But I will say the comp has updated, so in terms of the units and some of the items, it's a little bit different. But as you can tell, Zap Attack is one of the best augments you can hit for the Ziggs comp, And that's actually going to be true of this tier list in general. You're going to notice that there's going to be like a variation that's the best, and then there's going to be like a second best comp version of it. So for example, this is like a Kalista that you would hit if you don't hit a fairy emblem. And now I'm kind of hopping all over the place, so I'm probably going to go back in order in a bit. But just to show you that we have a comprehensive view of what to play, what happens if you do hit the emblem versus not. All right, let's go back to talking about vertical emblems here. Witchcraft is very good if you're able to play it from high tempo early game where you play around Zoe 2, Poppy 2. And they buffed for Witchcraft in particular, so it's way stronger on stage 2 and 3. And so now if you start off with a Witchcraft +1 of some kind, it's going to be really strong for you to be very stable if you find a Nico as your frontliner, and then play around like Zoe, Poppy, Nico +1. There's two different carries that people often play with Witchcraft. One was Karma, and you would play Witchcraft Karma, and it's an easy Chrono that links with Zillion. But nowadays, people are playing Ryze because it ends up being a really easy tie-in with Zoe. Zoe gives you the portal, which curves out your early game, and all you have to do is find Taric, which is a Bastion for Poppy, and also a really good item holder, and then you have Ryze fit in very well. So you actually have multiple options, and why we call it Witchcraft Flex. And you could even also go Witchcraft on Gwen, because Gwen's a warrior, so you could do a warrior with Fiora and Gwen. And of course, as you know, 2 emblems does complete the trait. So if you find a double Witchcraft emblem, you end up popping off with the 8 Witchcraft and just CCing everything. One thing important to note, Witchcraft Crown is significantly worse at the beginning of the game than Witchcraft Crest, because Witchcraft Crown gives you a Hextech Gunblade and a Cassiopeia, and that is just a lot weaker in the early game than it is later in the game. For reference, if you compare it to something like a Frost Crown, you get a Protector's Vow and a Swain. So you get instant frontline and a 3 cost. And people are going to struggle to kill Swain early because he has so much HP, and Frost ends up being very powerful when they convert a unit with a kill. But Hextech Gunblade scales off how much damage you do, and you're not going to deal that much damage early, and you're playing a Cassiopeia as opposed to a Nico. So yeah, that's a huge difference. So just keep that in mind. Witchcraft Crown is still good as you continue throughout the game at 3-2 and 4-2, but kind of bad early. Fiora ends up taking whatever leftover AD items. You don't have to go for perfect Fiora items, but a lot of times people do. I would say instead play around whoever's your main Witchcraft carry, which ends up being Ryze or Karma or whoever else you duo. Karma's vertical Chrono has also gotten a major buff as well, where now they rework the timing of when things end up activating and healing. And so now 6 Chrono is much stronger. And they also kind of reworked a little bit of that attack speed into just raw damage from ability power. And so now you just kind of hit 6 Chrono and you just kind of obliterate things once you hit the 5 costs. But as we just said, it is dependent on the 5 costs. You kind of need to hit the Camille because, well, how are you going to hit 6 Chrono without Camille? And Chrono on Morgana is so good if you can get the 6 Chrono, but then you got to hit Morgana. And then you also have to reconcile the fact that you're playing some of the most contested units in the game. Very hard to hit this core, and a lot of people are going to be playing Karma when they don't have a Chrono emblem, when they don't have a Witchcraft emblem, when they don't have a Preserver start. A very common thing for people to do right now is slam Shojin and Morello, and then, like, what do I do? Oh, Shojin's kind of bad on Ryze. Let me just play Karma instead and play, like, Fiora, Gwen, Karma. And so this is going to be kind of hard to hit. So the worst part about Chrono, especially if you get it early at 2-1, is that you probably know that you're going to be 3-way contested, so you might have to be a little creative. One possibility that people don't really talk about is that Vex is a Chrono mage. And so there is a possibility that you could play Nami temporarily by having Karma items go on Nami, and blue buff ends up being quite good on Nami. And then you obviously want to hit something like Ainora, which is the top end mage, but chances are you're often just going to play something like Galio for frontline utility and then building around Vanguard. So something that you might see in the mid game is Vex, Galio, Tom Kench, Ahri, Hecarim, and then play around Nami to duo cast. And then you play like a 4 Chrono setup that way. Another possibility is that you hit Jax and Camille, so maybe you throw in multi-strikers there as your 4 cost carry, but I personally don't like it because you don't really want any of these items on Kalista, and they also reduce the attack speed bonus on her. But Chrono is very flexible because you only need to play 5 units to get the trait of it, so you end up having a lot of slots open. Ezreal is now the best 3-cost reroll in the game alongside Hecarim, and I think Ezreal is very powerful once you start getting him online with 6 Blaster. They gave him a bunch of single target damage so he doesn't get stuck on tanks anymore. You see how he has like a bunch of extra AP bonus damage now at the end of his ability. And also now he doesn't blink to a different spot every time he casts. He only blinks if necessary, which makes him very consistent. In the past, Ezreal would just blink, like if he was here, he would just blink to this middle part and then blink to the bottom right and then blink to the front line for some reason. And that would just make him hit different units every single time. And now if you corner him, he'll most likely AoE the same target twice and wipe them out on the second cast. You do want 6 Blaster though. Blaster Crown is very powerful. I mean, it gives you Shojin and Ezreal, so you might as well just put Shojin on Ezreal in that case, and it gets you going. So if you play 4 Blaster variation, just know that you're probably not going to win nearly as often or just have lower cap. The other thing worth noting is that you might also notice that we're not playing like the Mordekaiser 3 Vanguard, and instead we're kind of playing a Pyro Arcana hybrid, and that's because they buffed Varus, and I think Varus is a lot better now. People used to think that you play Hui, Ezreal, Mordekaiser, 4 Vanguard, 4 Blaster, and that was it. But now I think you end up wanting to play around this kind of front line. You don't have to chase Shen 3. You don't have to chase Rumble 3. In fact, you can have 2-star everything here and just Ezreal 3. But if you're going to be rolling for a long time on 7, just keep your options open. Ezreal positioning does ultimately do matter, though. Like, don't just default him in the bottom right. If they clump to the top right, make sure to put him where Varus is and shoot across. He's going to aim the largest clump. And then the last thing to note is that items on Smolder can be good, but often can be bait because Smolder isn't the most important part of this comp, and you rarely get to the point where you hit Smolder too. So yeah, just be very mindful of that. Warwick Reroll is still really good. They actually buffed around Warwick a little bit. They improved like Vanguards. They improved some of the augments. Like What the Forge, for example, is surprisingly an incredible augment for Warwick, because not only will you get the Corrupt Vampiric Scepter, but maybe get things like Rapid Fire Cannon, Death Defiance, and other really, really powerful stuff for Warwick. And so, like, now he's just, like, even better. And so Warwick ends up being quite insane. Generally speaking, though, try not to play Warwick without the Corrupt Vampiric Scepter unless you're just an absolute beast and you just know you're going to hit it later on, or you just don't care and you want to have fun with the doggy. It is a little bit sad because Fine Vintage was actually buffed for 3 rounds, but now they nerfed it to 4 again after the B patch. But I still think it's quite good if you can make an unkillable Warwick. 6 Vanguard is often the play, but if you find a way to get to 7 or 9 Frost, that's obviously another way you can play it as well. Twitch 3 is better, but still kind of fake in terms of items. I always end up trying to go for Olaf 2, just because Twitch 3 late game just doesn't really do nearly as much still. While Ezreal is the strongest ranged AD 3-cost reroll, Hecarim is the strongest 3-cost melee carry in the game. He's just so incredibly powerful at all stages of the game. At stage 2, if you have a Hecarim 1 and you give him like 2 items, he actually can legitimately 1v5. And in stage 3, if you somehow get Hecarim 2, you're not going to lose a single fight if you get 3 items on him. And you have augments that really empower him, like Unleash the Beast or Find Your Center, or Press the Attack, things like that. And that's because they reworked Hecarim, so now he doesn't have like this weird awkward charge animation where he bounces off a unit. Instead, he consistently gallops over and then just swipes and AoEs everything down. And Hecarim is so strong. Never really sell Hecarim out of a box if you have any kind of sword or opening items that can be good. If you have like tier Rod and you have, you know, upgraded AP units already, like Ziggs 2 or Seraphine 2, yeah, I could probably see yourself not using Hecarim. But in general, Hecarim's like the never sell unit right now when it drops end stage 1. There's a couple of variations that people play with Hecarim. The first is just vertical multi-strikers if you get things like Press the Attack, because it just ends up being really powerful. And the nice thing about 7 multi-strikers, you actually don't need to build healing as big of a priority. But I will say the highest cap version seems to be playing around Arcana, and you end up getting things like, you know, the full Arcana on board, and Hecarim gets a ton of AD. If you get Arcane Conduit, which is a new augment that's been reintroduced to give extra bonus items, that's also very nice. But yeah, the game plan is pretty straightforward. Stay on 7, roll for Hecarim on 3, get 3-star Hecarim, watch him infiltrate the back line after he kills the frontline unit, and then make sure when Hecarim gets past the frontline unit and jumps into the back line, make sure you ping it and then type in, "What are you doing here?" That's a BoJack Horseman reference in case anyone missed that. The last of the S tier comps is Karma Preserver Flex, and this is basically what happens if you don't hit like an emblem. This is one of the best 4-cost comps that you can play, and you're going to expect this to be at least 2 to 3-way contested every single lobby. If no one is playing this, you should probably try to angle for it because it's just very good. And if you find a way to get Fiora 2, Gwen 2 online, you don't even need Karma 2 at all. You can just have Karma be anti-heal. Like, you can just hold red buff or Morello and that's it, and then just like itemize Fiora Gwen and run over everything in the mid game. They're way too consistent. Now I know what you're thinking. Gwen is kind of bad now because her AI looks so weird. She's very defensive. She kind of lost a lot of her snip-snap offensive capabilities. But just believe me when I say that if you get all this online, This board is just so hard to deal with. They buffed Preservers, they buffed a lot of its late game potential, and the 5 costs are still bananas. You just get all this online. It is really hard to deal with, especially if you have combat power. Speaking of combat power, you might have noticed that we've actually added things like combat bandages to like every single vertical trait here, and that's because combat bandages is just really, really strong. They buffed it significantly and they bug fixed it, so we never recommended it before because it just didn't work. The bug was that it didn't work stage 5 onwards. So you would have combat bandages all the way to stage 4, and then you don't have an augment. So now it works, and it was so good that they had to hotfix it. The big thing about this composition is that people roll too often for the expensive units, and they don't play around the 3 costs enough. A lot of times Nico 2, Swain 2, and just like a Fiora will be good enough to stabilize you with some other 3 cost BS. Like sometimes I even have Bard hold items because they did buff Bard. And so just keep in mind that you need to be a little bit more flexible and open-minded than just like rolling for exactly these units, and that's what makes this composition kind of tricky. We briefly mentioned it in the S tier, and I'll go over it as quickly as I can here in A tier. Ziggs is very good right now and very commonly contested. The big reason why Ziggs is so good is that there's so many augments that you could justify picking for Ziggs. Ziggs really wants a lot of items early or really powerful traits like Be As Friends or Honeymancy +1, or a hero augment, or other special unique things like 2 tanky to give you extra Bs, learning the spell to help scale your AP. You know, getting things like artifacts is really powerful with it. There's just so many different ways that you can empower him. And also there's fun ways you can position him. I actually think that Ziggs is probably going to be very contested this patch. So just keep in mind that you think you have a good Ziggs spot, but there's going to be other people playing Ziggs. And if they do, don't try to be too stubborn and hard force it if someone else has a better spot than you do. Because you can still play a lot of things like Blue Buff Deathcap is quite good on Karma. You can actually play Ziggs and play like, you know, this setup and then instead go to Veigar late game. Blue Buff is still a really good item on Gwen. So maybe you play Gwen, Fiora, and you just flex a little bit and then go into Preserver Ryze. So just don't feel like you have to. But I understand if you really want to no scout, no pivot. Kog'Maw is still very good in the stats. And now Kog'Maw has changed a little bit where you're not actually playing around Tristana anymore because you don't get that free fairy item. Instead, you play around 4 hunters, which also got buffed, and you want to duo around Jinx. However, the composition does run into a little bit of awkward issues where you kind of actually want to roll at 7 because you want to get everything online at 7. Like, you basically play this core and the 4 hunters on 7, but you kind of have your max odds on 6. The situation you might encounter is like you hit Kog'Maw 3 and you have like 4 rumbles and, you know, 5 Nunus or something like that. Just like push levels, roll at 7, and then see if you can hit things like the Olaf Twitch, maybe in that Diana if you're very lucky. Kog'Maw's items haven't changed much. Red buff, Shojin, plus Last Whisper is really good. Also, there are Honeymancy variations of Kog'Maw. You can play 7 Honeymancy. And 7 Honeymancy is just one of the best traits in the game. It's actually kind of a shame we don't have any variations that show you the power of 7 Honeymancy, so we might have to change some of that to make sure to reflect it, because 7 Honeymancy is a very powerful vertical. Jinx is also your duo carry, but you're very unlikely to get these many bows, so just slap on whatever 8 items you can on her, as well as Olaf. Arcana Ryze is one of the low roll AP outs. What I mean by that is it's a pretty solid comp to go for if you have no emblem, no direction, and generic items like Rage Blade and Morello or Rage Blade red buff with, you know, defensive items. And you're like, I don't know what to play for. And Ryze is often uncontested if people aren't really playing for like a portal vertical. So you might end up getting like a lot of easy top 4s. And the nice thing about it is Arcana has an immense ceiling. You just kind of have the true damage on Xerath after purchasing charms, and you can win the game and push to 9. The reason why this composition can look bad a lot of times is because you often are either rolling incorrectly or you just don't have enough resources. When you're playing this kind of comp, a lot of times you need it from high econ. And so people end up lose streaking a lot, which happens a lot, right? Let's say on stage 2, you are just losing a lot. You have no board and you're just like, okay, I'm going to go for a 5 loss. But you scan around, you see like everyone playing Karma and Preservers and stuff like that. And you're just like, oh, what do I do? You can just like try to go for a loss streak until 3-5, go to level 7, try to stabilize a little bit, and then play for Ryze instead. And then go to level 8 and roll for most likely Vex and Taric before you hit Diana and Nora. And then just go for Arcana Ryze. If you want a simpler version of Ryze, try Preserver Ryze, and that's basically the same as Karma Preservers, but instead of playing Karma and the Warriors, you play around Ryze and the Portals. This is just a cheaper version of the comp and something that you can stabilize on. So you play Ryze, Taric, and Zoe, and that just gets you out of the Karma Fiora lottery. And the power of this comp is that it pushes you to 9. And if you end up getting things like Diana, Morgana, and Milio, and you get it faster than everyone else, you can actually start to outcap some of the people who are struggling. So this is just another variation of a pretty common comp that people play. So don't always feel like when you roll down, you have to play for Karma when you have the Preserver Core. All right, Big Shapes made some big gains. They buffed big gains a lot, and that's also a really powerful way to synergize with Shapeshifters because you get multiplicative bonus on your HP. And so if you do find a way to get the Shapeshifter rolling, it's really good. Also, the usual stuff is really powerful. Eternal Growth, Martyr, things like that is quite good. And they also buff Varus, so, you know, now you can play for like a reliable AD line. I will say a lot of the power budget of things like Varus is on the execute, and so 1-star Varus ends up being very weak because he just doesn't do enough damage to get them to execute threshold, and that ends up snowballing. If things live a little bit too long, then Varus wastes his ult on small units with low HP to execute them, and then you're just kind of behind. So Varus 2 is a really, really big deal. The exception to that is if you hit a Smolder 1, and then you get Smolder with items, you can have Smolder 1 kind of get you to 9. Because ultimately, the composition needs to hit Briar. If you're playing like Jace, Elise, and 6 Shapeshifters this way, you end up kind of falling really far behind. Namzi and Shavada are better early game, though, now, so you can probably put items on them. Namzi, in particular, seems much more consistent for DPS and can hold items well for Varus. And then the last thing is execute items are really good on Smolder, so Pyro or Gold Collector or things of that sort are very, very good. So all that shimmers, don't take things like Mogul's Mail, take Gold Collector, play it on Namzi early, and ladder that all the way up to Varus/Smolder. Yes, I know Gold Collector is not very efficient with Pyro, but it's still good stats, and you get gold. This is the version of Kalista that you play if you don't hit the emblem. We probably have to change some of these augments, actually, because we still show Golden Quest. Don't take that. You play 5 Faerie, and without the emblem, you just end up playing around like the multi-striker aspect and lean into that. When you play Vertical Faerie and you hit that emblem, you don't really need multi-striker because, you know, you basically have so much power in the trait. But without it, you're probably dependent on having Hecarim hold items and then eventually relay that over to Camille. And I do think that this is a very consistent comp, but the key to success is getting to 9 and playing Morgana. If you can get a way to play to Morgana, you end up doing very, very well because it ties in everything very nicely. But this is kind of not necessarily the primary game plan unless you open up a really strong way to get into the line, like an early Hecarim, and you're like contested. You don't want to play reroll Hecarim, or you open up like Ash Jax and, you know, things are just not lining up. Maybe that's how you end up getting into this line. 6 Warrior is very good, and they buffed Warrior to now get 20 durability when you hit 6 Warrior, which means 20% damage reduction. That's insane, because that basically gives them so much survivability to the point where now you can kind of build them a little bit glass cannon-y. All you need is like a healing item, a damage item, and you're pretty much good to go. But because they also made Faerie a little bit harder to hit, and you don't really get this crown as easily on Katarina, you end up going for Preservers. It's actually missing here, but Milio is the unit that you want to play here with Bard, because that way you can get the Fairy Queen crown. So we need to add that after this video. But if you find a way to get 6 Warrior, it's very, very efficient. The thing about this comp is that Fiora and Gwen are really hard to hit, so trying to play around them as your primary game plan can be really tricky. So a lot of times you're going to have these Fiora items on Daniela, and, you know, these Gwen items onto someone else like Akali or another unit. And then you're going to try to play quite stable 2-star boards while rolling for Katarina 3, and then eventually picking up things like Fiora and Gwen once those Preserver players die. If you don't have a Warrior Emblem, I would not suggest playing this unless you have an overwhelming amount of tempo and really powerful augments, or you hit something like Caretaker's Ally and you hit like, you know, Neela 3 and you kind of have to play around it. Those would be the situations I would play Warriors. Molten Caramel Rumble is the other hero augment that I think is quite decent. It's nowhere near as strong as Zap Attack because you don't have the flexibility of it, and I think the cap of this board is pretty low. It doesn't really win many games, but you farm like top 2, top 3 very often if you have good items for Rumble and you're able to get it going. Part of the reason why it's strong this patch is because they buffed Blasters, the trait, and so you end up getting a lot more extra base damage amp. So Rumble ends up being a little bit stronger that way. The other thing to note is that even though they buff blasters, you don't necessarily want to go into vertical blasters. You still want Arcana, and having things like Xera's late game for true damage is really key. Another thing to note is that Mordekaiser 3 is now much more of a damage amp carry, and you can kind of give him a lot of other secondary damage items. Crown Guard, Spark, +1 could be very, very powerful on him. But it's pretty much the same comp. Preservers. Maybe late game, if you really need a cap higher, drop Justana and play Smolder 2. And that's a situation where somehow you hit Rumble and you're so far ahead, and for some reason you just like are staring at your board, you're losing fights, and you don't know what to do. Just hold on to Smolder, because Smolder 2 is better than Tristana 3 for sure, especially if you don't have a Faerie item on her. Cassiopeia Shapeshifters has now improved significantly because they reworked Cassiopeia to deal much more damage. Her Witch Fang says empower the next 3 attacks to deal magic damage, which makes her quite powerful in the early stages of the game now. The thing is, itemization hasn't fundamentally changed. You basically want like Rage Blade stacking on Cassio because the rate at which he attacks is really important. But I will say that if you find a way like to get Gambler's Blade on Cassio, it's quite good. And now Shiv is very, very good on her as well. The best 3 costs to itemize for tank is Nico, but sometimes you put it on Swain. Syndra is actually quite a reliable 2 cost to also itemize, but you give her like whatever's left over. This is like the best in slot Syndra, but you're not going to get it very often. So many times Syndra just ends up with things like Giant Slayer, Guard Breaker, Shojin or something like that, because you're just left over with whatever you can get, because you kind of need to have all your carousels dedicated to Cassio. Funny enough, there's actually one comp that I think is really good with Anger Issues, but Anger Issues makes you not win the game. It's like Anger Issues secures you like a 3rd or a 4th, like guaranteed, but you probably won't go higher than that unless you hit Briar 2 and get items on Briar. Build Different technically got buffed this patch, and that's because they made Milio a lot better. They have Milio now get 90 mana as opposed to being 100 plus previously. So now he just gives so much mana to all your units. But the thing is, Build Different is still play around 5 costs. In fact, I kind of believe that Build Different is kind of a B tier comp. It's just really expensive. The difficulty of Build Different is it kind of plays like Kalista and Karma, where you need to hit all the 5 costs to really unlock the power of it. But you have to get the economy to do it, and it's not really like a Fortune comp, because you can't really pick Fortune. You have to pick Build Different. So it's a little bit awkward. I would say that Build Different is a lot better on portals like Gold Subscription and Scuttle Puddle, where you can just get a ton of economy and likelier to hit some of these things. I could spend like a lot of time talking about Build Different because it really depends on like your early game and like what units you're hitting and like what ends up being a very good early game. In fact, maybe I should do a video on that because I think Build Different is just always interesting to watch someone play. But I will say that's very, very, very hard. So just avoid playing unless you feel really confident in your skills. Before we wrap up with the B and C tier, I want to let you guys know that this is probably the most unsolved parts of the meta. There's a lot of comps in here that are either experimental, they're really risky, or we just haven't found the optimizations for it. So a lot of these have potential to move up. Some of them actually might even move down as the other parts of the meta get optimized. So just keep that in mind as we proceed forward. We're now in the B tier, but I actually think this comp is probably A tier when you have the conditions for it. I think that's part of what makes it a B tier though, is that you don't really get the conditions that often. Multi-Striker Reroll is a B tier comp on our tier list. I personally think it's A tier, but that's just because I think Ashe is really cool. They reworked her, so now she scales in fight with the number of arrows. The longer the fight goes, the more arrows she shoots, kind of similar to Ahri, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And the main reason you would play this is if you have things like Category 5, press the attack, or maybe you're just playing like a silver lobby where you just get a ton of economy and people are just playing low power in general. But because it's like a little bit on the more conditional side and it doesn't necessarily cap that high unless you're able to get to like the top end with like multi-striker +1 or 7 multi-strikers, it can struggle a lot. But I do think this comp is very, very fun and quite good. Defensive items on Jax with AP, attack speed on Ashe. In fact, one thing I wanted to point out is if you do get Category 5, you don't have to play Last Whisper. You can go for Ruin's Hurricane plus Rage Blade, and then go for like Even Shroud on Jax instead, or maybe Last Whisper on Kalista. You can go for Kassadin 3. I would just say that that's usually a luxury and not something that you're planning for, because Kassadin is 1 and 2 cost, so he's kind of expensive relative to the 1 cost. And once you hit Jax 3 Ashe 3, you're not like staying low level for Kassadin 3. And the other is that he just falls off really hard right now because they nerfed him a lot. So I'd rather play around Hecarim instead, Hecarim 2. But out of all the B tier comps, I think this one is consistently the strongest because you'll see it pop off the most. Pyro Varus is also okay, and this composition is basically dependent on whether or not you can hit Smolder. But Varus is more improved now, so this is something you could play. You also can have Olaf be a temporary item holder for your Pyro and play kind of a hybrid Pyro Frost, which is also cool. You basically play Olaf plus Nasus plus a Hui for the Blaster, and then you play that as your mid game. So be a little bit more flexible and open-minded, but it is a backup 80 out in case you start off with things like Last Whisper Red buff, and you have the ability to go into Pyro. Deja Vu Galio is still pretty much the same. It hasn't changed at all. I think the one thing I will say is that What the Forge ends up being surprisingly really good on Galio because you can go for a bunch of different artifacts now on him. But for the most part, you pretty much always just stick with 6 Vanguard and Rage Blades, and it's pretty solid. Like, there's nothing really bad about it. So they reworked Ahri, and Ahri now scales in fight. The more she casts, the more Firefoxes she releases to deal damage. And so that's changed her itemization, and they also nerfed Adaptive. And so the double adaptive build is no longer working. So now Ahri kind of wants blue buff and damage. And Ahri actually is quite good with some of the hero augments. So if you have like high horsepower, Witchy Wild, this is probably the comp that you want to lean towards. And then you go for like 3 stars with Ahri and then go for the usual like Ryze duo carry or Zoe duo carry. But I will say that this composition kind of struggles a lot in the late stages of the game to actually close the deal unless you're ahead of tempo. I've hit this board before and then like gone fourth and I was like, what? I hit everything and then I started losing. So the jury's out. This is probably still going to require some innovation. It's entirely possible that we're just not playing the right version. If I were to take a guess, I would say that the reason why this isn't doing as well is because we're not playing 6 Scholar. And 6 Scholar is quite good in the stats, but no one really knows how to play a 6 Scholar board without having 0 frontline. Because if you think about it, on 8, 6 Scholar would be probably no Xerath here and probably no Hecarim, and then you play another Scholar like Bard. So you're telling me it's like Taric, Lilia, Poppy, Bard, and Scholar Emblem goes on Taric? It's like, it's kind of weird, right? So I feel like people don't really feel that confident in that kind of setup. But my personal belief is that this comp still needs some innovation and it can move up from B tier. A comp that's probably going to stay in B tier is Veigar. In fact, the data suggests that this is a C tier comp, but everyone knows that Veigar is one of the highest cap champions in the game. And that's because Veigar just has infinite scaling and it just can't be bad. If you play Nora with Xerath and you get true damage and you scale it, it still might win lobbies. It's just really rare. I would say that the Vex Veigar is just super, super high roll. And the way you get there is like March of Progress, or you get like some kind of reason to roll for it because you have infinite econ. Maybe start off with Veigar 2 somehow, like Veigar pair into Veigar 2. That would be probably the reason to commit to it, but it's on the rare side and it can win a good amount of lobbies. Just don't expect it to do anything better than 7th or 8th if you don't get everything online. Jinx Wukong has fallen considerably since they basically changed Wukong to be much worse late game. The rework to Wukong, in my opinion, has not been that successful yet. They might have to actually buff him a little bit, which is a little bit sad. And as a result, Jinx's best frontline is gone. You still can play this comp. It's just kind of like Veigar Vex with lower ceiling. Like you hit Jinx 3, you hit Wukong 3, and you just don't win as often as Veigar and Vex. But the floor is higher. You're not going to go 7th, 8th very often, especially if you hit Jinx 3. You will probably like land a lot of solid 3rds and 4th. So it's kind of like an inverse, like a safer version of Veigar Vex. Instead of going 1, 2, 7, 8, your placement range is often 3, 4, 5, 6. And if you get to 6 Hunter, I do think 6 Hunter, by the way, with like, Hunting Frenzy is actually quite unstoppable. If you play the Olaf variation of it, it's actually quite good. So yeah, I actually might want to update this because I think that maybe one of the conditions to play this is +1 Hunter. But again, these are like innovations that we'll probably put onto the tier list once we see more data of it. Right now, there's just a couple hundred games of it. And for the most part, people think that it's just mid. Arcana Ryze is a comp that kind of popped up towards the end of last patch. And people still are not very convinced by it. It's kind of like Arcana Ryze, but the AD version of it. If you look at Arcana Ryze, you're just playing the Arcana core with Bastions, but then you play like mages. With Arcana Varus, you're basically playing the Arcana package with Bastions and Warriors. This is like an out that you can play for if you kind of recognize that you're just contested across the board and you see like Varus open. A really common setup is like, let's say you have AP items and like a mana item like Adaptive or something, and you're just like opening up like this. But you kind of recognize that there's like a Chrono +1, there's like a Witchcraft +1, and then there's like a Portal +1, and there's like a Preserver +1. You're like, oh my god, it's just I don't want to be in a 5-way contest for like Karma Ryze in some way. What you can do is play this comp, lean a little bit more into AD, and then try to find your way into this late game and play for a safe top 4. Vertical Eldritch, surprisingly, is doing kind of bad despite the buffs. I think part of it is that you actually want to carry Karma as your forecast and not Nami necessarily. But Karma is the most contested forecast AP carry in the game alongside Gwen. So good luck with that. I would say that the +1 tempo for Eldritch is pretty considerable, though. It should win you a lot of the early mid game. And if you do find a way to get to Syndra 3 still, it can do well. And also, you always have the out of playing for 10 vertical Eldritch, but I would say that doesn't happen very often. Yeah, overall, like Eldritch vertical is pretty much playing for top 4, and you're hoping to curve out and still try to get to Briar to ultimately be safe. But I've seen this comp lose to so many things. You just don't have enough damage to keep up with like the Preserver late game or the big verticals like Frost and Faerie. I just don't see it winning many games. Arcana Fast 9 is still alive. It is like something that you can play, but honestly, it should probably go to C tier because some of its augments just got nerfed, like Fortune and Golden Quest. So a little bit outdated here, but we always keep this on the tier list because sometimes you just have infinite gold and you get to 9 or somehow you fast 10. You're like, what do I build? So we always keep this on the tier list to help you have the frame of reference to play for strong board. Because if you put these units into the stats, you'll always have a high average placement. But like, how do you ever get here? You either have to be Jeff Bezos rich and get there, or you have to have had some crazy scenario where you get like a combination of augments that give you infinite econ to get there. So yeah, it's not really going to happen very often. C tier is basically the hero augment tier in Sugarcraft, but there is one comp that we have our eye on, and that is Dragon Dracarys. This is the newly reintroduced Draconic Mastery comp. The reason why it's here in C tier is because I think it's having an identity crisis. A lot of people think that you're supposed to reroll Namzi with it, but almost all the stats indicate that you don't actually play it, and you're supposed to tempo. Also, I think that maybe playing into the Ziggs Shapeshifter might be bait, and secretly, Draconic Mastery might actually be best for like a Pyro comp, because you play Namzi and Shyvana early, and then try to get to the Smolder, and then get Pyro Smolder guaranteed. So I'm not entirely sure, and I think that's why we have it in C tier. We often keep our like undecided, like low sample size, could be really dangerous to play and risky. We keep it like here, and I think that's probably wrong. This composition is probably more like B tier, but we'll see how things develop on the patch. Let's blast through the hero augment very quickly. Hero augments Nunu got nerfed pretty considerably. The damage scaling is just not really there as aggressively. If you do end up playing Sweet Tooth Nunu, try to go for 7 Honeymancy and try to play for the Kog'Maw or Ziggs variation and play for a safe top 4. Pure Witchy Wob with Witchcraft is a lot weaker now. Now you have to hit like Witchy Wob and the Witchcraft emblem, so I probably would only play it if I get like a Spatula start or maybe like let him cook. And as we covered before, I'm pretty sure Witchy Wallop is better in Scholar Ari than it is just solo and focusing on Poppy. Same thing with High Horsepower Lilia. It's like the same thing as well, which is kind of better in Scholar Ari than it is here. But this is like the Bastion Kalista variation. I think this is pretty bad. Don't play it. But if you get stuck in a situation where you absolutely want to because you just want to, succeed with lesser popular comps, then go for it. Spider Queen is horrendous, the worst hero augment. Went from the #1 comp in the game to the second worst. So how's that for balanced thrashing? Don't pick it. It's really terrible. The only time I'd ever consider it is if you have like a lot of copies of Elise and you have a guaranteed way to kind of activate things like artifacts onto Elise. And someone has to be in last place, and that is currently Sugarcraft. They nerfed Sugarcraft's HP. It's no longer as durable. They also made Gwen very unreliable as a solo carry. So just generally speaking, don't play Sugarcraft. Very weak right now. If you do end up going for it, recognize that your win percentage is still the same, but your AVP is much lower, which means that you're just likelier to go 8th very often. And if you hit Sugarcraft +1 and you don't get item augments on 3-2 and 4-2, you are very far behind. That being said, I would say that Sugarcraft still at its peak is top 3 strongest things in the game. #1 being 10 Eldritch, #2 being a 3-star legendary, #3 being the Sugarcraft max cash out. It beats everything, basically. So I would say that it's not worth chasing. But hey, don't let me tell you how to live your life. So that was a lot to go through. But in summary, plus emblem equals plus LP. And if not, try to go for a fast 8 or a reroll comp as soon as possible and try to play for that top 4. But I will say that it's a really exciting patch to play because there's so many things that are viable and a lot of new things to play with. And I'm really glad that Riot made a huge patch in general because the set feels very fresh. So check it out. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and I'll see you guys next time.